10 months after the death of George Floyd, the trial for the officer charged in his murder is underway in Minneapolis. The jury heard opening statements in the trial of Derek Chauvin before prosecutors began laying out their case. Prosecutors say the 19-year veteran of the Minneapolis Police Department refused to let up or get up as Floyd pleaded for his life. They claim Chauvin used lethal force against a defenseless Floyd for over 9 minutes, even as bystanders begged the former officer to remove his knee from Floyd's neck. But Chauvin's defense attorney argued the 46-year-old died because of drugs he had in his system and a heart condition. CBS News correspondent Jamie Yukas is following the trial in Minneapolis and has the latest.
Family and supporters kneeling in remembrance of George Floyd, just moments before the long-awaited trial of former police officer Derek Chauvin began.
You will learn that on May 25th of 2020, Mr. Derek Chauvin betrayed this badge.
In opening statements, prosecutor Jerry Blackwell making the case that Chauvin's use of excessive and unreasonable force caused Floyd's death.
He put his knees upon his neck and his back, grinding and crushing him.
The prosecution then showed the jury 9 minutes and 29 seconds of cell phone video that shocked the world.
I can't breathe.
Floyd insisting he can't breathe more than 20 times.
I can't breathe.
Bystanders pleading with officers to do something.
Bro, but you can get him off the ground. You've been a bum right now.
6 minutes, 7 minutes, 8 minutes in.
The man ain't moved yet, bro.
Jurors watched Floyd lose consciousness. Chauvin took notes as the video played.
I would tell you that you can believe your eyes. That it's a homicide, it's murder.
Don't leave me by myself, man, please.
But defense attorney Eric Nelson argued Floyd's death was caused by underlying heart disease and drug use.
And you will learn that Derek Chauvin did exactly what he had been trained to do over the course of his 19-year career.
Officers initially responded to a call about a counterfeit $20 bill.
The evidence will show that when confronted by police, Mr. Floyd put drugs in his mouth in an effort to conceal them from the police.
The defense says officers struggled to get Floyd to comply.
This was not an easy struggle.
Floyd's death sparked protests on a scale not seen since the civil rights movement. Chauvin is charged with second and third-degree murder and second-degree manslaughter. The second-degree murder count carries up to 40 years in prison. The jury is made up of 9 women and 5 men. Of those, 8 are white, 4 are black, and 2 identify as multiracial. CBS News legal analyst Ricky Kleeman says this was a crucial day for both prosecution and defense.
There are studies that say that 80% of the jurors' minds are made up at the end of the opening statements.
The trial's first witness, 911 dispatcher Jenna Scurry. She testified that she called the police on the police after seeing what was happening to Floyd while watching from a surveillance camera.
And my instincts were telling me that something's wrong. Something is not right. I don't know what, but something wasn't right.
The prosecution says it will call the chief of police and several Minneapolis Police Department employees who will testify to Chauvin using excessive force. The case is expected to last 4 weeks. Elaine?
Jamie Yukas, thank you. For more, I'm joined by Rebecca Royle. Rebecca is a CBS News legal contributor and a professor at New York Law School. Hi, Rebecca. So what were your big takeaways from day one of this trial?
So the prosecution is trying to focus the jury's attention on that 9.5 minutes, the video that we've all seen and that the jury saw in full for the first time today. The defense is trying to broaden the lens and look before that video at what happened earlier and tell a different story. Sow the seeds of reasonable doubt by showing that perhaps George Floyd died not from Chauvin's actions, but rather from a drug overdose or from his own pre-existing conditions, and also that the officer acted reasonably, or at least possibly acted reasonably, given how seriously Floyd was resisting arrest. So you can see that these are going to be the strategies of both the prosecution and the defense. I think another thing that's noteworthy is that while this trial like all trials, will focus on the facts, and the jury should focus on the facts. It's also a trial about race, the policing, the criminal justice system in America, and it'll be really interesting to see how the lawyers navigate these broad social issues with the specific facts of the case.
Yeah, I mean, there is so much complexity, as you point out, and questions about systemic racism, policing now, you know, in our modern American society. But let me ask you this, Rebecca. Derek Chauvin is facing second and third degree murder charges. What must prosecutors prove to get a conviction on those charges, and how do those charges differ from first degree murder, which Chauvin is not facing?
Right. So first of all, for all of the charges that Chauvin is facing, the prosecution has to show that Chauvin's actions caused the death of George Floyd. So that's key to all of the charges. And then each one of the charges requires a different state of mind from the officer, or requires the prosecution to prove a different state of mind. For second degree murder, which is often called felony murder, the prosecution has to show that he killed George Floyd during the course of committing another felony. Here it would be assault. And the difficulty for the prosecution is going to be showing that Derek Chauvin intended to assault George Floyd. So you can see how all of that evidence that the defense is suggesting it's going to point to about how Floyd was resisting arrest goes to that count. Can the prosecution prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the officer intended to assault George Floyd? The third degree murder charge is a little bit different. It's called depraved heart murder sometimes. And what it essentially requires, again, is that the prosecution prove that Chauvin caused this death, and he did so with a reckless disregard for human life. So they both differ from first-degree murder, which he is not charged with. The officer is not charged with. They differ because that requires intent to kill. So it's important to realize that none of the charges here involve intent to kill. They all involve a lesser degree of intent.
So Chauvin is also charged with second-degree manslaughter. Rebecca, what needs to be proven to convict on that charge?
It would be easier for the officers to convict him of that charge because all they would need to show is that he acted unreasonably. He acted in such a way as he put George Floyd at a reasonable risk of death. And so you can see that while the other charges require more proof of what Derek Chauvin actually intended, this one really requires the prosecution to just show negligence.
Well, based on your knowledge of the case, I mean, do you think prosecutors have enough evidence to win a conviction on one or more of these charges, or do you think the defense has a strong enough case for a not guilty verdict?
You know, the short answer, and maybe it's kind of frustrating, is I don't know. I think really it does come down to this question of causation that the prosecution has to show for all of these charges. They have to show that George Floyd's death was caused by Derek Chauvin. And when we all saw that video, I think it seemed, it was shocking in part because it seemed so clear. Of course, this officer caused the death of this individual in this horrific way that we all watched. But as evidence kind of spilled out after that initial video, at least there's a possibility that the defense might inject some reasonable doubt into that there was the use of drugs. He was crying that he couldn't breathe long before the officer put his knee on his neck. So there is a possibility that the defense will be able to, in some ways, show reasonable doubt. But again, it depends on what the evidence shows, particularly the medical evidence, I think.
Yeah, but you're absolutely right. I mean, that video, especially when viewed in its entirety like that, is undoubtedly powerful, undoubtedly compelling. We'll watch to see what happens over the duration of this trial. Rebecca Royle, Rebecca, thank you.
Thank you so much.